Welcome, everybody, to the second episode of our podcast called Europe First. My name is David, and I'm the president of the Charlemagne Club. Today, I will talk to Professor David Engels about his concept of Hesperialism and also in general about pro-Europeanism on the right. As you might recall, in the first episode, I talked to Nikodem Skrobisz, the head of communications from AWE Europa. AWE is a right-wing, pro-European political party. Maybe you can call it a political startup, exactly about the subject of pro-Europeanism on the right. So today we are continuing the discussion with another guest. Now, Professor David Engels is a very well-known figure among the right-wing circles, especially pro-European right-wing circles, due to his work on Hesperialism, which he developed to describe a certain sense of civilizational, right-wing, conservative patriotism. Civilizational, so going beyond the nation state, and in this context, meaning a certain sense of European patriotism. Apart from his work on Hesperialism, Professor David Engels also wrote plenty of books, especially the book Auf dem Weg ins Imperium, which positions that Europe nowadays finds itself in a situation not too dissimilar from that of the late Roman Republic with Caesar and Pompey and the Civil War, with the eventual reformation of the Roman Republic into a Roman Empire. Now, without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome you today, Professor David Engels.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to see you.
Yes, so I think our viewers and our fans, they know who you are. So I was thinking, instead of talking about Hesperialism, which they probably already know very well, what I wanted to ask you first is, what inspired you to develop Hesperialism, and why did you follow this particular route? Because, as a right-winger myself, when I think of my colleagues who are patriotic, conservative, they don't follow the civilizational route, right? Because they usually become Eurosceptic because they see the EU for what it is, how leftist and liberal it is. So why didn't you follow the traditional, let's call it Eurosceptic, maybe petty nationalist route? Why did you embrace civilizationism?
Yeah, excellent question. I think there are probably two reasons for that. One of the reasons is well known and rather autobiographic. As a more or less bilingual Belgian citizen, I grew up in two civilizations, or rather two societies at the same time. So I feel as well at home and a bit as a foreigner, as well in a German-speaking environment and a French-speaking environment. But I have both sides in me somehow. So from the beginning already, I didn't only feel as member of one nation state. I mean, Belgium being not even a typical nation state, but as being or as being part of a large part of what constitutes Europe as well, the Germanic and the Romanic influence. So from the beginning on, I saw that these two families have much more in common than probably they believe themselves. I'm always surprised by that many German people would speak about something and saying, yeah, this is typically German, for example. Then I'm always the guy who says, well, actually no, because if you go to France, they would probably say exactly the same thing about the same thing, believing that they are the only ones to have that. Of course, there are particularities also to the nations. I mean, all that is, of course, the richness also of our civilization, that there are these differences. But I think they have much more in common than they believe, and that is something that I always felt. The other aspect, of course, is my interest in Oswald Spengler and in the comparison of great civilizations. And from the moment onwards, I read Oswald Spengler's Der Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West. This large vista of world history is being essentially composed by huge civilizations undergoing even similar dynamics seemed very compelling to me. I mean, probably when I was 17, 18, and I read that for the first time, I was perhaps also a bit more malleable than I would be today. We all know that what you read with 16, 15, 17, 18 really shapes you. I read that book. And so this idea of understanding Europe as being one civilization, of being Abendland, of being what is generally translated as the West into English, perhaps not being identically the same than Abendland, but still always seemed very convincing to me. And so from a political point of view, I always thought, well, defending the nation state, defending national identities, all that is great and fine, but the European or Western identity and civilization always seemed really paramount, and I always thought that this is the main thing we had to defend, even more so as today. Indeed, there is not just one or the other nation state or national identity that is under attack, but the entirety of our civilization. So this is probably what brought me to always feeling extremely, let's say, compelled by this idea of a European civilization that needed more and more, by the way, defense.
Yes, so you say it's a strong feeling, and I can see that, growing up as an ethnic German in Belgium, being split between the Germanic and the Francophone world, definitely had an impact. But did you see yourself first through the prism of your nation or through your civilization or religion? What do you put first when you identify yourself? Is it European and Christian, then German Belgian, or the other way around?
That's a good question. Even more so as religious identity has become more and more important for me during these last years. Probably that 10 years ago, I would have said that I feel first as a European and then as a Christian. Today, I'm not so sure about that. Today, I would probably say that my main loyalty, my main form of affiliation or of identity probably goes to the idea of transcendence. So if I would have to choose between what is good in an absolute transcendent way and what is good for my civilization, I would probably put God or transcendence or what is good and beautiful and just and so forth before. But at the same time, I'm not sure if that question is really one, because at the same time, I become more and more aware also that everything that is really at the core of our European civilization, I'm not just talking about the psychological core, this Faustian spirit that is so typically for the European, but that is really at the core of our civilization, this longing for transcendence. And I think this is at the core of every civilization, by the way, cannot thus be really separated with Christianity. So I would say that a European identity that is truly understood and interiorized can never be brought into a fundamental clash with the idea of transcendence. But that being said, there are these two elements. So being part of the European civilization that is defined at the same time very strongly through the Christian approach of transcendence comes certainly first. And only then I would identify myself as being, of course, sharing the German or Germanic and the Romanic cultures, and being a Belgian is probably what comes last. But I think this is of course because the Belgian identity is a bit complicated. It's not a real nation state. It's there is an identity obviously in Belgium. It's a bit more subtle to understand. It's not as if it is just a made-up state, as many people would say. There is definitely a long tradition. If you look back at the tradition of Burgundy and of course of Lotharingia and the Austrian and Habsburg and imperial influences and Spanish influences. So there is something particular and peculiar to our region of being squeezed in between France and Germany. That goes back a long way. But I'm not sure if this is really so strongly felt today anymore. So that is why probably I would rather put this general belonging to two language groups before my national identity. At the same time, I've often been told that this is, from a certain point of view, again, typically Belgian. That's this idea of identifying with Europe, identifying as being part of different things, is not so original, because this is once again at the root of Belgian identity, of trying to fight with this identity and to understand it.
Indeed. I think there is something peculiar to this region, Burgundian Low Countries region, which makes it uniquely exposed to European civilizational thinking, because I'm Polish and you lived in Poland, you worked in Poznań. I would say it's quite the opposite. You know, it's a country of what I would describe as petty nationalism, and you know, these a country of national grievance, nationalism. Yeah, so I wanted to maybe ask you if you could contrast your experience or perhaps your view on the Burgundian environment and how it was conducive to European thinking to what we have in Poland. You know, what is your opinion on Polish nationalism? Do you see problems with petty nationalism, as we call it, slopulism in Poland? What are your views on that?
Yeah, yeah. I have to think about that. I mean, what is peculiar to this Burgundian identity and Belgian identity is that we have generally a quite positive attitude towards the idea of empire. So whereas, if you speak in France, for example, about this idea of a European empire, and if you speak proudly of the idea of the Holy Roman Empire, the Sacrum Imperium, Charlemagne, and so forth, most French people will look, they won't like it. They think, well, that's a German idea. Somehow we French people want to be a part in our nation state, and if they speak about Charlemagne, they think that basically this was some form of proto-French nation state. They wouldn't like to see the Carolingian Empire as being a supranational empire. And if you speak about that to the German people, they also generally don't appreciate, curiously, the Holy Roman Empire, because generally they think that this was more of a problem to the rise of a truly German nation state. They think it was too influenced by the Catholic Church. It was too supranational, and so it somehow is considered as being the thing that made it impossible for Germany to be on equal footing with France and with the UK when they created their nation states, and when Germany still was somehow within this supranational idea. But the Belgians generally like that. So if you speak positively about Charles V, for example, and probably Belgium is, together with Austria, I'm not even sure about that, by the way, but Belgium is probably one of the states where Charles V is one of our own, basically, one of our heroes, and so we like this idea, and Brussels was one of his favorite cities, and so so I think there is a quite positive view about this idea of a European supranational empire in Belgium, and I think that is at least in certain intellectual milieux. So yeah, and if you compare that, of course, with my experience in Poland, where I lived for 7 years, I would say there have been very positive and also negative influences or experiences in Poland. I mean, what I so liked in Poland is having this impression of being in Europe, an impression I don't get so much in Belgium, at least in the big cities. If you go to not only to Brussels, but to Liège or to Charleroi, or even to Antwerp or Ghent. I mean, the problem of migration, of Islamization, of wokeism is so big, not only in the big cities, but even in medium and sometimes small cities in Belgium, that as a European, you feel, and as a patriot, of course, as a European patriot, conservative, you feel quite marginalized. And so I always had this impression, I live in Belgium, I live in my country, but I'm not anymore in Europe somehow. It has become something strange. And when I lived in Poland, my impression was the other way around. So I always felt as a foreigner. Unfortunately, I had big difficulties in finding roots I could somehow claim as my own when I lived in Poland. It was too far, probably, from my own, let's say, Belgian, French, German identity and so far. But at the same time, I felt in Europe. I had this impression, once again, I live in a normal country where everyone more or less everyone, is from the same nation, speaks the same language, is Christian, or at least has a positive outlook on Christian tradition, is middle class, is even ethnically European. So something we have lost in Belgium for a long time. So I appreciated that a lot. I also like very much for my kids who grew up in Poland, who speak fluently Polish. So at our dinner table, generally they speak Polish together, while my wife and myself, we are sometimes wondering what are they talking about exactly. So they are perfect trilinguals now. They speak German, French, and Polish at the same level. So we were really happy to have them there. It gave them the possibility also of understanding yet another important part of European identity, that is the Slavic or Slavonic part of our identity. They could grow up there in security, in peace, could do a lot of stuff they wouldn't be able to do in Belgium. So all that was great. I even liked, especially at the beginning, Polish patriotism. I thought, at least from what I saw at the beginning, that it was not necessarily the kind of patriotism that thinks itself better than the others, which is sometimes a tendency in France or in Germany, where there's this feeling of superiority. I didn't see that so much in Poland, in comparison to certain milieus in France or in Germany. But now comes the but, of course. But of course, everything is not fine. What I saw as a big problem in Poland during these 7 years is that, from my point of view, it is still a deeply traumatized nation that is living a lot in its past, that is still trying to grapple with the trauma, not only of the Second World War and of communism, but of the Polish partitions. And it has this, it is still living in this victim and martyr mindset that can be understood historically. I mean, I can only condole and say, wow, such a history is not an easy thing to deal with. But of course, there is this tendency of somehow indulging in this victim mindset. Everyone is an enemy. The Russians are the enemy, of course, number one. The Germans, of course, the enemy number two still, and they didn't pay the reparations, so we want money from them. And the Russians took our territories in the east, and they hate us. And the Ukrainians, well, we can at least now, we have our ally, we can at the same time patronize a little bit and look down at the same time, so we can help them, but we feel good about that, but we don't forget that they massacred us in the Second World War, so it's also not ideal. Sweden is just on the other side of the ocean, but doesn't exist, strangely, so there is nothing to the north of Poland, at least in the Polish mentality. And yeah, France is very far. Nobody's interested in that anymore. England and France, they're a bit considered as the traitors because of the Second World War. The only good nation, basically, is the US. And that seemed a bit, how to say, from my point of view, that didn't seem very grown up. And I often said, well, I can understand geopolitically this is a huge issue, being, of course, with this history in between the big German motor of the European economy and Russia with its Russian mir and its irredentism and its imperial things and so forth. But I mean, there are other nations in this world apart from Germany, Russia, and the US. So why not start to realize there are other European nations apart from Germany? Why not also have good relations with Japan, with India, with Korea, I mean, there's so many other states that could be nice allies and that could help to go a bit beyond that. And so it's a bit of a pity that the, in principle, quite pro-European attitude of many Poles, especially from the right side, I like that their vision of Europe was quite a civilizationalist vision. It was not a Brussels rationalist, wokist, universalist vision, but rather this old-fashioned civilizationalist vision. I liked that a lot. I liked also the form of patriotism that I could see. But as you said, there is a huge issue with just living in the past, just fighting all the lost battles over and over. And of course, all this issue with the reparations, once again, I said it and repeatedly, I can understand why there's this wish of settling the record straight, especially after Germany under Angela Merkel became also some form of moral self-declared superpower. So I can understand that Poles could say, okay, well, now before you treat us as Nazis, just let's have a little look at the past and settle the record straight. I can understand that, but I never really saw that as being particularly intelligent from a political point of view. It made it absolutely impossible to work together with German conservatives. It was bound to fail from the beginning because this sum would never be paid. That was sure from the beginning. So somehow I could only understand it from an electoral point of view, saying, okay, we play a little bit on the anti-German card, so we get some percentages more. But that seems very not very far-sighted as a politics, and I don't think that from a psychological point of view, repeatedly re-anchoring these traumatized Polish nations in its trauma, in its victim feeling, in its martyr feeling, in its attitude of an inferior power begging for reparations from another power that will say, no, we won't pay. And then dealing with this feeling of, oh, I'm rejected again, so I'm doubly the victim. On the long run, I don't think that is very good also for the Polish mindset, especially now in the 21st century, when we have so many common enemies as Europeans, when we have so many common challenges that seemed somehow, as I said, somehow short-sighted. And I think that on the long run, this will have to disappear if the Polish conservatives really want to be still there in 20 years or something like that.
Yes, what can I add? As a Polish right-wing voter, it's always a difficult choice because the people who get it on migration and social policy, who are socially conservative, I know that if I vote for them, I also vote for turning Poland into an American protectorate in a way. And these grievance nationalisms, like you said, it's reparations from Germany. They demanded $1.3 trillion. Now they're going to demand reparations from Russia. They also hate Ukraine. They hate Lithuania because of minority issues. They hate Czechia because they also have a Polish minority. So it ends up, in a destructive loop.
Hungary is now also the enemy since the different attitude towards Russia.
And the French, they betrayed us in 1939. So this rhetoric keeps on going and it translates into real policies. So Poland, for example, not implementing digital taxation against American companies, canceling contracts with French military companies, maybe with American ones. It really damages Europe and our country. So maybe to ask from this point, we have the arguments. We have Hesperialism, we have activists and movements like the Charlemagne Club or Alva Europa. But how do we translate it into real change? Like maybe what kind of lessons have you learned from promoting Hesperialism? What works, what doesn't work? How can we change the mindset on the right to drive it away from petty nationalism and toward civilizational thinking?
I think that, unfortunately, time is playing in our favor because things are getting worse and worse, and people are starting to realize that we have all the same issues in all countries. But this is something that is quite logical. That even the most nationalists of nationalists are starting to understand that migration and demographic decline and the self-hate and wokeism and disindustrialization and artificial intelligence and our lack of a good educational structure and our lagging behind from the technological point of view, that all that is not just typical for France or for Germany. I think that most people also on the right, especially young people, start to understand with traveling, with going to, with consuming different forms of media, with going to conferences and on holidays, they start to understand that this is a pan-European problem, and that probably we have much more in common fighting against that than we have these grievances. So on the long run, history is playing in our favor, you could say. But at the same time, of course, it's sad to say that, because it means, of course, that things will get worse and worse. And time is on the one hand an advantage, especially also when it comes, once again, it sounds cynical, but especially when it also comes to the change of generations. I think that this classical petty nationalism and this feeling in Poland is surrounded by enemies, but there are many people in Germany who also would think that all the others are enemies, and the Poles took our territories, and France did destroy the Palatinate under Louis XIV, and the English took away our colonies, and the Americans did that, and the Italians didn't fight as well as they should have in the Second World War. There are people who think like that, and in France the same, and a bit everywhere. But I think it's a generational thing. So probably I don't think that many young people still think in these categories. So from a demographic point of view, there will be also a certain shift in more pro-Europeanism and a bit less of this primary nationalism. The only question that remains, of course, won't it be too late when we all realize, okay, now guys, we need to work together, and we need to start working together on a political scale in order to save our civilization. That is, of course, a risk. I mean, if you imagine things like utopias or whatever, like taking power in 20 years, what will be left of Europe in 20 years? If you look at demography, if you look at the degree of Islamization, if you look at how we are disappearing as a major power in the world, how we are losing speed in industry and in research, well, in 20 years, there will probably, I mean, it's still better to be there in 20 years than never, but the possibility of acting will be much more reduced in 20 years. So time is playing in our favor, and time is at the same time the biggest enemy of the European Union. And so the biggest enemy of the European Union, and especially, of course, of the European civilization that we are defending. And yeah, what can we do? Of course, that is a huge issue. We can just try to bring people together through initiative like yours, to be very present, obviously, on social media, to organize meetings, to repeat and repeat again the same message of basically of Hesperialism, even when people don't believe us. And of course, and I think that is probably the most important, to launch initiatives, concrete initiatives, not just speaking about elections, about problems or things like that, but starting individual projects, combining movements, trying to get, for example, to focus efforts on one region or one village or one town, trying to take over at least something like the government of one village somewhere in France, or one enterprise that produces interesting stuff, or launching a new initiative of cooperation, launching new ways to create some form of social security for European patriots, doing concrete things that show that a pan-European conservative approach can make a difference, that it is a mature idea, that it has the necessary manpower in order to realize a realistic and pragmatic and serious policy, trying to bind together people. I mean, the sky is the limit, basically. So So yeah, there should have one day a huge brainstorming session what kind of concrete project we could do. I mean, something else that is very important, I think, more and more important, is of course pedagogical initiatives, trying to organize regular summer camps, seminars, regional initiatives where people from one region work together. So stimulate people so that even there might be bottom-up initiatives that can rise. I mean, there are so many good initiatives now when it comes to summer schools and winter schools, and bringing young people, perhaps not only young people, by the way, together for a week or half a week or 2 weeks, talking about these issues, trying to discuss with them what they can change, what kind of implementation of a patriotic European mindset they could also focus on in their region, in their village, in their enterprise, their family, and so forth. I think that there are still a lot of projects to do that could somehow make people think about this ideology and also highlight its existence, of course.
Yes, in particular, you mentioned taking over local governments or winning elections, organizing initiatives, maybe building on that. Once we have some momentum, once we have, let's say, some influence in politics, what should we do with the European Union? Because the European Union of today is rather disconnected from the philosophical and civilizational foundations of Europe. It's in a way a globalist, leftist, liberal institution. But at the same time, it's there. The skeleton for the European proto-civilizational union is already there. So we are, I think, in this difficult situation. How do we approach this EU? But what would you suggest? A constructive approach of reform, or perhaps we need to destroy it and build it from the bottom up again, or should we infiltrate it? What's your view?
Yeah, that's a discussion we have had for many years, and I know there are many positions that all have some positive and negative sides. I think that probably given today's situation, I think that a dissolution and reconstruction of the European Union would be a big mistake, because I mean, it's there. It has its faults, obviously, but at least there is a structure. There is something that could be reformed somehow. But I think that, well, or let's say the other way around. I think that reforming the European Union is marginally less impossible than building it up from scratch. Because you could be sure, if we dissolve the European Union, if we want to establish treaties to get together again 28 or perhaps to 30 nations, how long would that take? How many years, perhaps even decades, would these discussions all over again? And then people would say, no, we don't want that. And there would be one nation that would say, no veto, I don't agree with that, and I don't agree with that. This would take years and years. We would never find any form of compromise of all that would suit all the people. So it would be a huge mess in a situation of strict urgency. So, of course, I know that rebuilding or rather reforming the European Union is also a big problem, because there are these mechanisms, there are these elites that are in place, there is wokeism that is so deeply ingrained now in the personal politics also, that have left to, or as it led to putting into place the people who are there. So this will be also an immense task. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget, once again speaking a bit about cynical aspects or Machiavellian aspects, that we need to, sooner or later, we need to work with the elites that are there. We can't replace everyone, neither at the nation state level nor at the European level. I mean, most of the conservative parties have this big problem that they don't have any real functional elite. They have people with a good rhetoric and people who are very motivated, but there's not enough people in order to organize a state If you imagine something like AfD taking over Germany next year, or Rassemblement National winning the presidential and perhaps even parliamentary elections whenever. I doubt very strongly that these parties would have the necessary manpower in order to fill in all the different positions that would need to be filled in the ministries. And of course, let's not even speak about the media, the universities, and so on. So there is an elite there. Of course, we need to replace people at a certain level, but the bulk is there, people who know where the keys are, basically, and we need to get them somehow to work with us. So there will be compromises that will be necessary, obviously. The advantage being, of course, that most people, once they have a place of power, do not care so much about ideology anymore. They want essentially keep their position. And so let's say I have enough confidence in the opportunistic nature, especially of people in high value places, that would probably prefer suddenly discover that they have always been conservatives, never really believed in all that kind of stuff, then become the martyrs of the LGBTQ flag, for example. So I think once the wind shifts, we could be amazed about how many people suddenly start to be on the other side. I mean, just think about what happened in the US when suddenly all the big tech millionaires, from Bill Gates to Mark Zuckerberg and others, suddenly started to support, or at least to make their peace with Donald Trump. So who knows? Yeah. So in the end, I think that trying to reform the European Union in our way is probably, given the current situation, more realistic or less unrealistic than rebuilding it from scratch.
Okay, so let's say we win. We have a seat at the table. We can change Brussels. We can change the European Union. How would you change it? What would you change in the Europe of your dreams?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I tried to outline that, of course, in a couple of recent books, and especially in the Das Abendland verteidigen, the Fond de l'Europe civilisationnelle. It has not yet been translated, very unfortunately, into English. And this is, of course, why I outline, at least from an ideological point of view, what would need to change. Now, I'm not a jurist. I'm not a lawyer. So I'm not a constitutional expert. So I've been much more interested in what needs to change in the spirit that animates people working for these institutions than in the institutions themselves. But I outlined, nevertheless, in my book, an alternative construction of the European Union, where I basically think that we need to turn the ideology of the European Union upside down. For the moment, the EU is extremely weak on the outside and more and more authoritarian to the inside, and we need to change that. We need to do exactly the contrary. We need a Europe that defends, that protects, that is able to make Europe's voice being heard in the rest of the world, to ensure our access to strategic resources, that has a military capacity that is respected somehow, not in order to attack anyone, but at least that's there so that other people know, okay, they know how to defend themselves and how to push their interests even outside wherever it is necessary. We need to be able to defend our borders from mass migration or from military attacks. We need, of course, to work together to defend our civilization when it comes to high value future technologies. We need to reconstruct our communication network. We need together to work against obviously criminality and so forth. And if you put that together, basically you get the outline of the, I would say, of the ministries or the secretariats that we would need: defense, border protection, research, communication, finances, obviously, because that's always what is needed. Of course, we need also some form of legal complementarity and cooperation, so that we basically are compatible with each other when it comes to production. So what the European Union did quite well, by the way, for the last decades. But I think that most of the rest could indeed remain with the nations and with the regions, and who knows, with metropolitan regions that are also, I think, much undervalued. So from my point of view, the example of the Holy Roman Empire is not that bad as an example for future European Union. So if we have different authorities that deal with compatibility, that deal with the defense of borders, that deal with the finances that are necessary for that deal a little bit with research and communication, I think that is with foreign policy, obviously, also. That is what would be needed. So in one of the sketches I published, I would say that we would certainly need an elected president or magistrate or ombudsman or something like that, however you want to name that. We need someone who has a democratic legitimacy from the entirety of or from a qualified majority, at least, of the citizens. Someone who could fit into the shoes of the old emperor. And we shouldn't forget, by the way, that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was an elected magistrate. So this elective component has even been there for that. So we would certainly need the famous guy who can take off the telephone. As I said, it was Kissinger who said, I'm not sure, was it Kissinger who said that Europe, what's the phone number of Europe? So we need
Yes, it was Kissinger,
someone
I think, yeah.
who takes off the phone when someone wants to ring Europe. We need some secretaries of state or some secretaries to deal with some commissioners to deal with these 7 or 8 main positions. Of course, we still need the parliament. Obviously, I think that is certainly something that can continue as it is, and probably we need to have a division between a higher chamber and the lower chamber. The parliament being probably the lower one, and then the European Council being the superior one, with the different heads of states, like some form of Senate. So that could be, of course, a possibility to restructure the European Union to make it a bit easier, and to become more, let's say, more reactive. But as I said, I'm not a constitutionalist, so there could be many other possibilities also of structuring that. Anyway, I'm quite convinced that given the future, as I see it, probably we won't even have the leisure and the time to just sit down, think about that, take 10 years or 20 years to draw different ideas. Probably all of that will be forced upon us by the event, by things like wars, competition, menaces from the outside, events that nobody of us is scheduling for the moment. And very probably it will be rather, or rather we could be pushed into a certain direction than really take the time to draw them. So that's why let's say, I think it is important to draw or to sketch these kind of ideals. I think that's important also in order to show to the voter that yes, you can be conservative and pro-European. Being conservative doesn't mean that you want just being back to the nation state and expand your territory, but that you can be conservative and very European, and showing and demonstrating that through alternative sketches. That is important. But in the end, I think it's rarely some form of abstract brainchild that will take over, but it's probably history that will decide these things, and we just need to be ready. We just need to know vaguely where we would like to go, and then so that we can react very quickly when opportunities are there. And then, of course, we have to improvise and work with the situation and the instruments as we find them.
Yes, I very much agree with, and I especially like the Holy Roman Empire approach. Heiliges Römisches Reich.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe to build on that, you say that Europe will in a way integrate and grow through crises. Um, you know, perhaps these crises are symptoms of decline, and you are very much uh, close to Spengler, I believe, right? So Spengler said that Caesarism is one of symptoms of decline of a civilization. So maybe if you talk about these crises, do you think that we will see the emergence of little Caesars in Europe? Will that be conducive to European integration and a right-wing, let's say, takeover of the European Union? And then, yeah, who will be the European Augustus who will end the civil war?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, civil war or this civil unrest does seem more and more probable. When I spoke about this perspective for the first time now 13 years ago, many people criticized me and saying, "Oh, civil unrest, civil war, all that is impossible today." And if you look at what happened in France during these last years, with a country that is really at the brink of disaster. If you look at the US also, with everything that has been happened there in terms of disaster, I think this is something that is very probable and possible for the next years, especially in a Europe that is becoming poorer and poorer by the day, more and more dependent on energy, also coming from the outside. More and more paralyzed politically. So I think with the lowering of our level of life, there will be more and more competition between citizens, probably also between autochthonous citizens and people of migrant descent, that will have to fight for these resources that are becoming more and more limited, and all that will of course create more and more dissatisfaction and unrest, and probably also violence, and not just the typically endemic violence we already have now in most of the big cities of Western Europe, but violence on a much larger scale. And of course, violence is something that can produce very quickly a new order, that can produce very quickly new people nobody realized were there, and that can become from 1 month to the other someone everyone in Europe knows, which would not be possible in a classical democratic situation. So I think there will be a lot of, let's say, different dynamics and potentialities around that we can't see yet for the moment. And yeah, Caesarism is, of course, I fear with Spengler the destiny, or at least the next step in the history of the West. Of course, we can deplore that if we want to, but everything seems to go into that direction. And I mean, already now the USA are showing how Caesarism is functioning with Donald Trump's second presidency, and probably all these extremes that the US are going through will only become more and more intense, either with a third mandate for Donald Trump, who's playing with that idea, or with some form of backslash of the Democrats. That could also very well be the case, with huge violences between both sides, or perhaps with someone like Vance or others taking over power. I mean, it is becoming clearer and clearer that the US are resembling really to the 50s and 40s BC, something 13 years ago nobody would have believed when I first talked about that, and that is now becoming obvious. Now the big question is, of course, what will be the fate of Europe? Will we even manage to have our own Caesar? Because I think that the alternative is becoming just some form of Greek provinces to the US empire. So I think that there is not much, or there are not much alternatives between these two. Now, of course, we all could say, no, we have to fight for a democratic, organically evolving European Union that can take its place in the world and so on. And yeah, of course, we have to fight for that and try to be sure of that. But I'm not really very optimistic that there's any possibility for that kind of goal. When I see the pace in which the world is transforming for the moment and how Europe is behind and falling more and more behind, I often fear that there are only these two possibilities: either a strong united Europe that would need indeed someone with a certain charisma that can defend it. And of course, we all hope that that kind of person will be responsible and democratically elected and so forth. It will not be just some form of military dictator, obviously. But this is one possibility. The other one being that we just become the Greece of the new Roman Empire, whose capital city will be Washington. There's not much between both, I fear. And of course, when we speak about Caesarism or Caesar, as you did it also in your question, I think we have to make the difference between Caesar and Augustus. Caesarism is especially a state of high, intense, violent competition between different Caesars that are not so much different from an ideological point of view with each other, but there are rather, let's say, competing forms of order, all wanting some form of one-man rule that is much less ideological than, let's say, more targeting very ancestral feelings of order, of tradition, of projection of the citizens into one person. That is a bit of the brink between plebiscitary rule on the one hand and some form of very charismatic Bonapartist influence. And so there might be several of them. And I don't think, for example, that Donald Trump is already in Augustus. I think that there will be some other Caesars following. I don't think that Elon Musk has said his last word either in US politics. I think there are others that are there, and it's not impossible in the US that we will see exactly what happened in the late Roman Republic, that basically the Republican, or to say, I wouldn't say leftist, but the Republican camp disappeared, and then basically what was left were all the people from Caesar's entourage that were fighting each other, where you had Mark Antony and the late Augustus and Lepidus. So basically all from the same side. And it's not impossible that if Donald Trump is, for example, murdered or dies in office or something like that, that we could have a huge competition between people like Vance, between Barron Trump, between Elon Musk, all fighting via social networks, via huge money influences, via artificial intelligence, via different influences over the deep state for power. So this would not necessarily be a choice about right or left or about ideological questions, but rather about big individuals. And I think that one way or the other, once Europe starts to decline more and more, this could be a possibility for us. I think, once again, cynically speaking, if our decline continues as it is for the moment, that is rather slow, probably we will rather degenerate into some form of Greek province of the US. If our decline is swifter, if it triggers more unrest and violence, then perhaps there might be something new emerging from that. These are the two main possibilities I see, not because I would be in favor of such a dystopian view of Europe, but rather because I fear that that my favorite possibility, that is having the time to think about Europe, restructure Europe, build up a Hesperialist Europe, that is anchored in democracy, that can and in citizen participation and responsibility, that probably we will not have the time for that, and also probably the citizen is perhaps not ripe anymore or not mature anymore in order even to understand these issues. A little bit like the late Roman Republic, where basically it was not just from a certain point of view, the decadence of the elites, but also the fact that the middle class had disappeared, and that most citizens were just wanting to vote for the competitor that would give them the most alimonies and money and most panem et circenses. So I fear this might be an outlook, and I'm sorry that I don't have any more optimistic things to say about that.
Yes, I definitely think it's a very pessimistic scenario of, let's say, Trump being Caesar fighting Pompey in Italy, then going to Greece, and the rest of the empire just kind of looks on. They see who wins, and we could be a Belgian province or a Gallic province, just staying there and waiting for the real fight for power in the real center of our empire to conclude. So I think definitely what you outline are very dark scenarios, but I think I have hope in Europeans. I think we've overcome much worse. We called our club the Charlemagne Club, and if you look at the time of Charlemagne, it was a total disaster for Europe, no? With Moors from the south, Asian hordes from the east, something what people could describe as collapse of science, collapse of culture, and then you had the Carolingian Renaissance. Sorry?
The Vikings from the north.
Yeah. And then the Carolingian Renaissance and Charlemagne and the empire, they rebuilt Europe at the worst possible moment. So maybe before we conclude, I also wanted to ask maybe one personal question about censorship and maybe that problems that you might have had to your views. Because, when we defend Europe, we defend the real Europe, which is conservative, patriotic, let's say, ancestrally rooted in Europe. We might come under fire, and not only from the mainstream, but also if we push this pan-Europeanism, perhaps we can come under fire from the right, the petty nationalist right. So I wanted to ask about your experiences in censorship and maybe political conflicts that you had to experience because of your, let's say, more traditional views, but also because of your pan-Europeanism.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say perhaps my advantage or disadvantage was that I without wanting to incense myself, but I mean, I wouldn't say I was also one of the first. That would be absolutely exaggerated. But when I spoke about these ideas since the 2013, 14, 15, there were not many people around speaking about that. So this was not mainstream at all, neither on the left nor on the right. And I had to pay a price for that, of course, from an academic point of view, from a social point of view. So I was immediately considered as being right-wing for what I said. And of course, it became difficult to publish in mainstream journals and having a decent academic career and all that kind of stuff. What is a bit funny is that today, many of the people who criticized me perhaps 10 years ago, even openly in reviews and so saying all these dystopian perspectives are absolutely irrational and that will never happen, and oh, this is so conservative, and how can you be against migration, and how can you criticize the structure of our democracy that is so great, and so forth. Well, many of these people are now writing things that are more extreme than what I did before. So I have sometimes this impression of not having changed my position, and somehow being overtaken by people who were on my left that are now on my right. And so sometimes I now feel that I'm more on the moderate side. So without having changed anything, some of the people criticizing me are now more extreme somehow. And many of the things that were considered as going too far 10 years ago are now said by others. Now, the problem, of course, is that I had to pay the price for that, and so that people consider me as being this evil, right-wing extremist and so forth. Whereas my positions, if I had started to tell them only today, and not already 10 years ago, would probably cause much less trouble to my own existence than they did. But of course, I mean, I don't regret that. I have never published anything with having in view, will people like this or not? If I had just written things in view of would it be appreciated, I would never have published most of the books I did publish. So I paid the price, but at the same time, I sometimes hope that I also helped people to become aware of a certain situation. That is also why I'm so happy and proud to see how now new initiatives like yours and the others you spoke about are now starting to function, and that they can also rely a bit on the work I previously did myself. So I'm really happy about that. And at the same time, I think that slowly the wind is also a bit shifting. I mean, as you asked this question, that is a very personal question. I see also these last months that some of the mainstream media who never had any contact with me, starting to contact me once again. And these comparisons with the late Roman Republic that people thought to be so absurd, well, they're now doing that themselves and realizing, oh yeah, there was this guy 13 years ago who did all that, so perhaps he wasn't that wrong either. And criticism of mass migration and criticism of desindustrialization and criticism of being so dependent on the US or on Russia or China or whatever. All these things and many others are slowly becoming, I wouldn't say mainstream again, but they are not considered anymore as being so detestable as they might have been 13 years ago. And I think if once again, if things continue to progress as they are doing now, very, very probably people like us, if I may say so, will be in the middle of society. Perhaps not in the middle of the media yet, because as we all know, most, especially of the mainstream mass media, are still dominated, of course, by more leftist and green people than by people from the center or even from the right wing. But I think still that things are shifting slowly. Of course, you will be under attack, but probably you will be much less under attack now than 10 years ago. I think that our position, if I may say so, may become what I always hoped it would become, that is some form of middle ground where as well people from nationalist right-wing parties and from universalist left-wing parties can say, okay, this is perhaps a middle ground. As people from the right will say, yeah, okay, they're a bit too European for us, but they love our civilization. They're on our side when it comes to tradition and being proud of your history and just indulging in loving what we Europeans have done for the last 1,000 years, with all the negative sides, of course, too, but still having this positive approach towards history. And the left may see, okay, yeah, but they are perhaps a bit too traditionalist or conservative for us, but at least they are pro-European, at least they are not nationalist, at least they have a constructive attitude towards the European Union and its current functioning. So who knows? 13 years ago, having this position placed you in the middle of nowhere, basically. Now it could place you right in the middle of the compromise that might be the key to our future.
Perfect. I hope so too, that we can be the middle point that brings the left and the right, brings out the best from both groups, and in the name of civilizational patriotism, of supporting Europe in this chaotic multipolar world which is emerging. So thank you very much. I think that would conclude our interview. It was great talking to you. And also thank you for all your work on Hesperialism. You held the fort.
Thank you very much. I did
so
it
that
with pleasure.
initiatives like ours could develop, and hopefully there'll be more of them all over Europe, and one day we will see Hesperialism go mainstream, I hope.
I hope so. I hope so. I'm quite confident.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very
And
much for the invitation.
hopefully see you in Brussels.